The Maurin Academy is a 21st century agronomic university. We draw inspiration from the life and work of Peter Maurin, co-founder along with Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement, as well as from various intellectual and practical engagements with other currents of thought. Maurin envisioned agronomic universities, places where people could learn about life, culture, agriculture, science, and religion together. And he envisioned houses of hospitality, places that, quote, bring the scholars to the workers or the workers to the scholars. These tenets are at the core of the Maurin Academy's mission.
Now, what I want to do is tell the story of how we in modern times broke this natural law, this natural cycle. And it's a tragedy. So, what I mean by that is that nobody did this because they're, dastardly, terrible, villains who wanted to destroy anything. Actually, people did this type of thing probably for all the right reasons, or at least some of those reasons were right. But we did break the natural cycle. So just to try to give you an idea, this graph here is a graph of the population growth. Most of which has happened just in the last 200 years or so. It's such a climb. It's such a steep curve that you probably can't even see the curve. But you can see here that we go from roughly 1.5 billion people in 1900 all the way to now we are at 8 billion people on the planet going on 9. And the story I want to tell is that synthetic fertilizer, artificial fertilizer, and pesticides allowed us to support this population. In all good intention, we did this and kind of naively, but nevertheless, this happened, and we need to actually understand this. Food is necessary for life. It is one of the most important subjects that we could possibly study. Some people find it boring, but actually, it is not boring at all if you don't have enough food. So it's a subject that ought to concentrate our attention. And this is a story of human innovation allowing for a sort of natural distortion or a distortion in nature that may have really sizable repercussions for us. So, what is synthetic fertilizer? What is that? Let me tell the story of that. So, nitrogen is the most important element. Plants, of course, need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to grow, and a lot of other things too. But nitrogen is the most important for the purposes of developing human agriculture because it's less stable. So it's the hardest to keep in the soil naturally. It needs to be replenished more frequently, and that's where all that compost and mulch and manure and so forth would come in. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen gas, but plants cannot use it directly. They need it to be synthesized. And for most of the world's existence, they were synthesized naturally through those processes and turned into urea and ammonia. And that is what is needed for plants to grow. Now, how nature makes nitrogen, it does that, as I've implied, through animal and human manure, through bird guano, various bone meal, the leftovers of all the animals, fish, and of course the compost of vegetable matter, going back into the ground. And nitrogen fixing legumes of various kinds are important. They grow in the soil and immediately give the soil more nitrogen. So in the past, all these things were necessary to keep the land fertile. But in the mid 19th century, human beings started to make this big move. Well, they started actually earlier than this in the 17th century, even, but by the mid 19th century, it was becoming a crisis. People were moving to cities due to economic reasons that I don't have time to get into now, but urbanization was well underway, factory production was escalating, and people were leaving the farmland. And so, one thing that was not really anticipated, but could have been, probably was anticipated by farmers, but was this fertility crisis, because the beings that were doing all the eating and defecating and urinating and creating garbage were living elsewhere from where plants were grown and animals were raised. In the past, they would have lived in the same zone, in the same vicinity. And so their leftovers and their remnants and their, all of their waste would have gone pretty naturally back into the place where they were, which would create fertility. But now they were, more and more thousands and even millions of people in the cities. Okay. And so now waste, which is necessary for that cycle of fertility to continue, was now way away from the land that needed it. So the first thing that people did, because they hadn't invented artificial fertilizer yet, was to go after guano, because it was found that bird guano it was better for conveying nitrogen than any other kind of manure. And so there was this huge land grab. It was such a dire problem, such a dire situation. There was this huge land grab to try to find as much and to conquer and control as much territory that had a lot of bird guano as possible. So the U.S. actually passed the Guano Islands Act in 1856 to assert its military sovereignty over 100 islands or more within its territory for purposes of guano extraction. Because without that guano being put back on the farmland, they wouldn't have been able to sustain the fertility necessary to grow the crops that they needed to sustain the city. So that's how they handled it at first. And it was like the gold rush, basically, and of course it had huge political implications. But then came synthetic fertilizer, artificial fertilizer from Germany. Around 1909, Fritz Haber developed a method for converting atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. And he did this for two reasons. He was a true scientist, and so he was just exploring what he could possibly do. But also he understood the farm fertility crisis, and that needed to be answered probably with more than bird guano eventually. And so he invented a method of using high pressure, high temperatures, and chemical, I think mineral type catalysts to extract from atmospheric nitrogen ammonia. And of course, that's been innovated way more since then. But, his knowledge combined with the knowledge of Carl Bosch industrialized the process for the German chemical company BASF, which still exists today. It's one of the biggest companies in the world. And this is known as the Haber-Bosch process. And it is what still, with modifications, creates most of our synthetic fertilizer today. It also created a better capacity to build bombs. BASF became a huge supplier of munitions manufacturers to create more German explosives, because the same sort of stuff that creates ammonia can create bombs. And in World War I, Germany would have had far fewer bombs were it not for BASF and the Haber-Bosch process. And this is something that always happens, like whatever scientific discovery a person undertakes gets used eventually to do anything it can be used for, including weaponization. Ironically, Haber won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of synthetic fertilizer, but he also pioneered bombs and chemical warfare for Germany during World War One, which didn't eventually allow Germany to win, but it certainly upped the military game of every country involved. So, what are some facts about synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which has really been a game changer for our agricultural productivity? And remember, this is, we are now in the zone of transcending or going beyond natural law. It is made primarily from natural gas, not oil, so that's important to know. The process uses right now, about 1% to 2% of our global energy supply. After World War II, fossil fuel industries grew rapidly and due to rising demands for transport, fertilizer, and plastics. Okay. And I have my arrow pointing towards this truck full of plastic encased vegetables from wherever they're coming from, because all of this goes hand in hand. The truck or whatever transport is used is fueled by fossil fuels. The fertilizer is oil or gas based. Plastics are made from petroleum. So all of this relies upon petroleum, a product that is made from the remnants and leftovers of the dinosaur age, right? So it's a product that right now is getting a little bit more expensive, but for the past 100 years or so has been extraordinarily plentiful and cheap, and has allowed for this boom in transportation, fertilizer and farming, and plastics, but has an end. It does have an end. There is not an endless supply of dinosaur and plant life oil and gas from millions of years ago that can be extracted. So, we have a problem there. But in the 20th century, natural gas and oil extraction got cheaper, and it allowed for this growth in agriculture. And now about 80% of our ammonia, which is, was used in agriculture, is produced for fertilizer. So we have a real strong dependency on oil-based fertilizer. Now, when it came to farming, this is the man who most systematically applied this discovery of fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer to farming in the name of helping people to avoid hunger and famine. Norman Borlaug was an American scientist who genuinely was concerned with global hunger and pioneered industrial farming, what we now recognize as industrial farming, because of his humanitarian impulses. And he combined this idea of using synthetic fertilizer, developing irrigation systems, so taking water from one place, putting it in another, and chemical pesticides, and then developing hybrid varieties of some central grain crops that could feed a lot of people. So before GMOs, there was the use of hybridization. And so he did his best, and his team did their best to create crops of wheat, rice, and corn that would grow the most abundantly, that would be in fact, shorter in stature, so they were more easily harvested, and so on and so forth. And by doing this and spreading this knowledge elsewhere in the world to the extent that it was received, he and his team and the people that came after him did indeed very much raise productivity in these areas and reduced, at least initially, hunger. So, to give you an idea of how well this worked, in 1900, wheat yields were under 1 ton per hectare, but now we get 3 to 5 tons per hectare. In the 1930s, corn yields were about 25 bushels per acre. Now they're 170 to 180 bushels per acre. Huge difference. And correspondingly, we've had a huge global population increase. So, this is part of the reason why the gains were somewhat short lived, because along with the more plentiful food, more people could be sustained. And so, approximately 4 billion people alive today, or about half of the Earth's population, are alive today only because they are sustained due to synthetic fertilizer increased crop production. So that's both good and bad, because you can feel the precarity of that, because fossil fuels are not going to be endless. So we have these partial gains from this leaping over of the natural law. We have global calorie production, which has increased dramatically. Um, and we can create more nutritious hybrids, and we do. So in the crops that we create now, especially with GMO crops, we can increase vitamins and we can increase protein levels and so on. But we also see the population has grown accordingly to the increased number of calories available. And still, we can say that food is theoretically available to the world and that we can, quote, feed the world. But we also can see that the quantity of food that we can possibly produce does not solve hunger, because hunger is due at least partially to our own human behavior, not just to the number of calories that are available or how many bushels of grain we can possibly produce on an acre. Hunger is mostly produced by humans' inability to, cooperate with each other. So we wage war, we engage in political corruption, we fail to actually support our farmers and our consumers with proper infrastructure. We enforce economic inequality because it's good for our political power, and so on. So I think there was this hope that if we could just solve the physical problem, we would then also solve the human problem, but it hasn't been all that easy. In the meantime, we have created some real dependencies on these artificial processes. So I have a picture of the Strait of Hormuz there, because that's probably first and foremost in people's minds, but it's just a little reminder. If the Strait of Hormuz crisis was the first time some folks had realized that oil has something to do with the food that they eat, this is probably good, because it does. So not only are your gas prices going up, but your food prices are going to go up, because the fertilizer is made with oil and gas. The transport of the food from wherever it's coming from is oil and gas, and the plastic encasing it is oil, and the 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 air conditioning in the store is also oil. And so, of course, the price is going to go up. And it should tell us how incredibly dependent we are on the inventions that we have created. We are incredibly dependent on fossil fuel based fertilizers and pesticides. And our dependence has developed a pace on our industrial agricultural systems, which require specific fertilizer, pesticides, machinery, and infrastructure. If you ask a farmer, can you change the crop? Maybe like corn is no longer really all that profitable for you. And they will say, well, but I have like all the inputs. I have the machinery, the silos, and the delivery system. It's all set up for me to make corn. How am I going to change to wheat, or how am I going to change to something else? So these systems have been put in place and sold to people that kind of lock them down, and they're pretty expensive. And so that has created a dependency on government. The US government, without the US government supporting our agricultural industry, it wouldn't exist in its current form. It is one of the most propped up sectors of our economy. And farmers don't want that, but that's just the way it is. And that's because this kind of farming has become a very costly process. So we are dependent on government, we're dependent on global supply chains and markets for keeping the prices up. And if there's no market, or the market is impaired by some change, then farmers stand to lose a great deal. So there's a loss of individual sovereignty, there's a loss of national sovereignty because our food system is so global. We also have a dependency on monocultures. This is something that Wiersbe talks a lot about. He says an examination of the plant variety in today's typical diet reveals a dramatic shrinking of the gene pool. According to the FAO, humans can eat roughly 30,000 plant species. 10,000 or so have been eaten at some time. Though 150 kinds of plants are eaten in diets around the world today, only four, corn, wheat, rice, and soy, provide the bulk, 60%, of our plant calories and protein. Even within species, there are often hundreds of varieties of corn or potato or apple, but we actively grow and trade only the tiniest percentage. One of the problems with monoculture, just planting a ton of one variety of a plant, like one variety of corn, is that if there is a disease that hits that variety, the entire crop is wiped out. So nature diversifies in order to kind of create a insurance, system to prevent that from happening. But the Irish potato famine was an early example of a monoculture turning into a disaster. The reason why we do this is because if you are just planting one type of corn, as Borlaug, would have recommended, it's just so much easier to harvest. It's predictable. You have the machinery for it. You have the right, fertilizer, pesticides. You know what you need to do. And this is why we do it. It's a sort of factory production mentality, and it works quite a bit of the time. But if it doesn't work, because a disease or a pest or something like that hones in on that particular variety, it can leave us with a huge vulnerability. So, yes, so like breaking the natural cycle has those types of consequences. But also, we human beings are, socially related to the land, how we produce things. And so, in the book I most recently wrote, The Gap in God's Country, I try to explore some of these repercussions for human beings. Because of the way we now produce our food, there's been a decimation of rural areas, meaning that most people cannot afford to stay in rural areas now and create vibrant communities because there's just not enough work for them, because the process becomes so industrial and so reliant upon machinery. It doesn't need a lot of people. And so in a lot of rural areas, there's not the money or the people for a vibrant community. So churches close, grocery stores close, and pretty soon people are left with, some folks in a Dollar General and a gas station. And now, even starting in the mid 20th century, because of this dynamic, societal disrespect for farmers and rural populations escalated. So there's this social bifurcation or binary, right, between the rural and the urban, and with everybody thinking to themselves, including the children of farmers, I'd rather not be here in this rural area because it's not sophisticated work. It's not, what I want to do with my life. And so there's this general disrespect for this occupation, which does not make it more fulfilling for the people who are left. There's this disconnection between rural and urban populations, which we're seeing right now in our political problems in the United States pretty clearly. Look at a red-blue map and you will see it. Something like twice as many male farmers in America commit suicide than male workers in any other field. So the suicide crisis is real. Health and mental health risks to farmers and processors of food are real. And some of that has to do with that disrespect and isolation, the decimation of rural areas. Some of this has to do with the type of work that they are now made to do, which is not as healthy because it's not in line with nature. It doesn't use human skills to the extent that farming could do. They may not feel a connection, or they may feel a disconnection to the land, to the animals that they are raising, that they would not have necessarily felt before. There's also potential health threats from pesticide residues and depleted food residues, and farmers are more susceptible to health risks because they are exposed to the sort of the detritus of their own process. Also, we have so much more meat because of how much excessive amount of grain, corn in particular, that we grow. But this isn't necessarily good for any of us. Are arguably Americans eat too much beef. And the reason why we can buy that and buy that fairly cheaply is because of really cheap corn production and other grain production. So, I mean, hopefully people are still with me. I know this is, it's not necessarily fun to talk about, but it's so important to really understand, not so that we can go the exact opposite direction here and now, but just so that we know what we are actually doing. So some of the more extreme costs, which you may notice more than the ones that I've mentioned, have to do with the cost of a detached economy on people who lose pride in their work, so they start to just buy things because, let's say I work in an office and I go to the grocery store and I get my food, and I don't know where it comes from and I don't care, and I go get whatever I need to live. I don't have any idea who made it or where it was made. I don't have any social relations attached to that, and I don't care. But I also am just doing something that makes me money, and I don't particularly care about that. So our economy has become so detached from our actual work and human relations that we may think of work merely as a means to buy things, but ultimately buying things doesn't satisfy. And, the most extreme case of people seeking satisfaction in buying things is hoarding. There's a whole channel for it, right? Like, that's pretty bad when you have a whole channel for the phenomenon of hoarding. And hopefully you won't watch too much of it. But, when there are certain people who become unable or unwilling to engage in normal human relations, and they just have relationships with things. Well, they didn't have relationships with, their environment to begin with. This is what they know, right? This is what gives them a sense of belonging. And these people can be so attached to these things that, no matter what it looks like, they will hang on to them beyond all reason. And also, of course, we have like various cults of bodily control, obesity, anorexia, plastic surgery in the extreme, and so on and so forth, which reveal a sort of abnormal relationship to food and physicality, detached from our environment, detached from our social relationships with each other. So these are some of the more extreme things which we may notice, but they are part of a continuity or a spectrum of an overall system that is out of touch with our natural law. I like this graphic because, if you want to know, how farmers feel, or if they contemplated it might feel about the situation that they're in, This is the relative amount of worth of this package of mainly air, which is, cereal. 4%, 4 cents of every dollar goes to the person producing the actual ingredients for this, probably wheat or corn and sugar. 4 cents to packaging, 15 cents to manufacturing, 21 cents to the retailer and distributor, 21 cents to marketing and advertising, and the remaining for the corporate overhead and profit. So you can see from this, I mean, first of all, this package of stuff is completely unnatural. Who knows what it is, right? But uh, you can see the farmer situation here. This is what we esteem the actual ingredients. This is our estimation of that, as opposed to why we buy this thing, which has a lot more to do, and a lot more of our money is being spent on packaging and distribution and marketing and so on. Um, so, and I think this is my last slide. We'll say more about the environmental costs, but among the environmental costs of this change in our farming has been soil degradation and acidification. So in Nebraska, for instance, there's areas of Nebraska that are in a second Dust Bowl situation. There is not hardly any rain. There's nothing growing in that soil. Partly due to, just the change in our climate, but also partly due to the fact that in the past it was farmed in a way where a lot was extracted from it and not very much was put back. So we have a loss of soil-based and above-ground biodiversity and fertility. The soil naturally is full of all sorts of stuff, like mold and spores and bugs and just, yeah. I mean, some people would find it gross, but it is like the source of life itself. And, but if you look at some of that soil, it's just dust. It's just mineral. And if it's not fertilized with artificial fertilizers, it's not going to produce anything. As a result of artificial fertilizers going on too heavily, it gets washed off into our rivers and streams, which produces an excess of nitrogen in our water and can produce algae blooms in both our freshwater lakes as well as in the ocean, and dead zones in bodies of water like now exists south of Louisiana. We have a depletion of freshwater reserves like the Kansas, Nebraska, Ogallala aquifer and other aquifers, and freshwater lakes that are being drained to try to irrigate in situations where it's no longer possible for there to be enough rain to grow these crops. We have carbon monoxide emissions from manufacturing and transportation of inputs and commercial products on a global scale, which contributes to climate change, and nitrous oxide emissions, which are more dangerous than greenhouse gases. It's a more dangerous greenhouse gas than CO2. So we'll talk more about these types of things in the future, but this is just an introduction. And I guess what I really wanted to do was give you a sense of the tragedy of this situation. I hate to say it, but when you go to the grocery store from now on, you probably should see this tragedy. It's not going to kill you. Just look at it and realize that this is not the best we could do, and it is creating problems, and we ought to be able to do something about it. It was entirely understandable that we went down this path. I think I sympathize with Norman Borlaug and the people who followed him, for instance, or even with Haber in developing nitrogen fertilizer. It was a problem to be solved. And without the solutions, people would have starved. But as we have gone along, it has become clear that just solving those technical problems, which is the modern mentality, if you solve a technical problem, well, then you'll be one step towards progress. That hasn't been the case. In some ways, we are living in this bubble, this material bubble that is built on petroleum, and petroleum is not a renewable resource. We can find it through our intensive extraction still, but we all do know that it is going to come to an end. So, what we've been doing is things that make sense in the moment, but they're ultimately self destructive because we haven't been planning for that day, right? When things turn. We do know what it takes to create natural fertility, but we would have to change the way we live. And nobody wants to think about that. I don't even want to think about that because it's probably going to mean the end of extreme urbanization. And I like cities. I can't find a way beyond this, conclusion. Turning away from this path would require a gargantuan effort at this point. I don't think we're going to do that. But I do think it's going to be forced upon us at some point. And why? Because all this time, we haven't been thinking about how to accommodate nature's demands. We moderns have thought that we can leap over that. We can leap over the natural law when it comes to our physical world and get away with it. But ultimately, you can't leap over any natural law and completely get away with it. There are costs and consequences. They're natural consequences. I would rather not experience them. But, can we do better? Yes, we can. Do we have the knowledge to do better? Yes, we do. Would it take a change in our way of life? Yes. Does it mean that we go back to the horse and buggy days? No. We are in the 21st century. We have the scientific knowledge and technological know-how to do this way better than people did in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Well, we'd have to think about it. And we're living in this realm where, as consumers and individuals, we never are encouraged to even think about it. We're not encouraged to see the reality of it. So this is my wake-up call. It was to me and continues to be, and hopefully to you, to just be aware of that. And as we go along in this class, I will be talking about things that we can do as individuals and on a smaller scale to have some impact on that. But I'm not going to tell you that that is actually the solution to this problem, because it's not. But can we do better as individuals? Yes, we can. Can we do better as a society? We absolutely can.